about every other week, I think. I read them and collect them actually because I think they epitomize the kind of leadership that we need in higher education. He's not alone because Dr. Jackson alternates with him, and together they have done a great job representing our higher education institutions here. So with that, I'll say thank you and go for it, Dr. Flamer.
Thank you very much. Now, usually when I teach, I like to have everyone introduce themselves, and I'd like to see eyeballs, so but I can't see everyone in this case, so I'll just forego that. And Jane, I want to thank you for being so patient with me, because you helped me through this process and you were very insistent when I was a little lazy. So I really appreciate you making sure that I got done what I was supposed to get done. Happy
to do it.
Thank you. And Kim, thank you very, very much for helping me get started with this today. And I'm not sure if you all know this, but I have the pleasure of working with Kim's daughter here at CR. And Megan Schroeder it's extremely wonderful. So I'm very proud to work with Megan. So Kim, I just want you to know that you've raised a great daughter. She's a great colleague of mine. So thank you. Really appreciate that. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started then. CR is not unlike most of the businesses in Humboldt County in terms of we've had to navigate some uncharted waters as a business as a result of the pandemic. One, our fiscal environment has changed dramatically since January of 2020. But also the fact that our business model, and I know higher educators balk at calling our institutions like CR and HSU a business, but I'm going to use that term today. Our whole business model has to change, because no longer can we deliver education as our traditional way of being has done. So we have to rethink our whole business model in terms of education. And so I want to talk to you very briefly about both of those challenges that we have. One's fiscal, but also education master planning, and how we have to face these challenges to be successful moving forward. And here we go. So there are two things we're going to talk about: the fiscal uncertainty, but also the education planning to meet the changing workplace. And let me get some background on how CR is funded. And it takes most people in the California community college system a couple years to understand this. But let me give you the crib note version, about 30 seconds worth. Is CR and community colleges are funded in arrears, which means we don't really know our final funding for 2019 until September 2020, right? And so we've been spending money this year on the promise of what the state told us they were going to give us. But I won't know for sure on the final 1920 until September of this next fall. And I also won't know the tentative budget that the state's going to give us until August or September of this year for this year. And why this is kind of different for California. I think that California is way above most states, but it's still a little tricky. Going into January, I think that most of my fellow CEOs in our community colleges were very happy with the budget. We had a budget surplus, everything was going really well. We had figured and we had hoped that the state would actually end up paying us what they owed us in 2019 and 20. And of course, then COVID hit in March, and the May revised budget from the governor went from a $5.6 billion surplus to a $5.4 billion deficit. And so all of the extra spending, all the money that we expected for growth to educate our students went away. So we expected the compromised budget to include a 9% deficit compared to last year. But the budget that was signed by the governor and the legislature just recently was a very political budget. They knew the realities of the fiscal cliff that the state was going under or going over. But given the election year coming up in November, they didn't want to make the hard choices of cutting our budget. So what they said was, we will fund you in this year as we funded you last year, but we won't pay you for it. So technically, yes, they're funding us the same way, but also they're not going to pay us what they owe us. They're going to put in a series of accounting deferrals. So what's going to happen is, so they're going to defer 6.6 million for sure in 2021 and 21-22. They're also going to have to defer 7.9 million next year if the federal government does not give the state of California its stimulus package, which the way that I'm following Washington, D.C., it looks pretty slim right now on whether that stimulus is coming to California. So in essence, what's going on is that the state says that we're not going to cut you, but we're going to defer payments to you for the next 2 or 3 years. So what we're doing is that the state's we're going to borrow from ourselves, and the state's going to have a series of IOUs to pay us. And I don't necessarily trust that the state's going to come and pay us in the coming years, because they haven't paid us the money that they owed us in the past. So what the Board of Trustees and I agreed to do is take a very conservative approach to our budget, in terms of saying, let's build a budget based on what we know we're going to get versus what we hope we're going to get. So we made that decision back in January and February of this year. What we had to do just to maintain a fund reserve is we had to cut $1.5 million off the top of the expenditures immediately. Now, let me go back a little bit and explain our fund reserve a little bit. CR for the last 12 years has struggled to maintain a fund reserve of at least 5 or 6 or 7%. Most schools in California have a fund reserve, a savings account, if you will, of about 10 to 12%. And CR struggled to maintain at least 5 or 6 or 7%. And if the state was going to cut us the 1.5, then we would be in the negative. So we decided to cut the budget by $1.5 million, and I decided to do it in 3 areas. One, clearly we had to reduce our payroll expenditures, because 86% of our budget is based on is payroll related. And I have very little wiggle room to cut the budget besides payroll. So we cut about $500,000 from payroll, and it came from classified staff and administrators. I also cut the athletic budget, and you probably read that I cut football out. So I cut football plus beach volleyball and all the associate part-time faculty and the expenditures that has to do with football. And that was a little over $500,000 in savings for next year and the year after. But also I had to reduce the associate faculty budget by about $467,000. And that's part-time faculty. And that's the hardest thing to do, quite honestly, because cutting faculty cuts the engine of the institution. And that was a hard thing to do. So if money comes back, then I'll reinstate the part-time faculty budget. But also, although this was a hard decision to make, but it was really necessary to make it, I see this as the pandemic as a wonderful opportunity. It's an opportunity to refocus CR's attention to imagine what it can be now and not to what it used to be. So we want to do our best to focus on being the region's primary provider of job-focused education and training. I think we have prided ourselves on that. And now's the opportunity to get back to our focus, which is that. but also not losing focus on the liberal arts as well. So but I want to talk about the education master plan process, and there are 8 areas of focus that we're going to use to reimagine CR. And we're working this summer to get our committees together so we can start reimagining the academic side of the house for us. Again, there are 8 areas of focus that we want to look at. And the first one, we want to be rooted in a local labor market. Most of our career education programs have advisory committees that work well, but we also have an opportunity now to work even closer with our economic development partners, but also HSU, and start looking at what does the county need for economic stimulus? And how can CR really be a strong partner in doing that? And for example, last year we had made a commitment to work with Nordic Aqua Farms. We see that as a wonderful opportunity to move the county forward, but also a tremendous opportunity to reevaluate and to refocus our education to future markets. But we also want to start looking at solar energy and how we can have an academic program for those areas. So we are stretching our wings, if you will, to look at what's possible and not what we currently have. How can CR be a partner to shape the economic development of the county? We really need to refocus our attention on that. But also I want to make sure that every degree and certificate that we offer will fit some level of the regional workforce needs. And it's not going to be a dead-end degree or certificate. It has to lead to something. Second area of focus are mid-career adults. This pandemic is forcing adult students back to school. And we know that to be true, and we want to focus our attention to how we can help these adult students be reskilled and retrained. And we know from surveys that these adult students need short-term applied courses to help them get an education and get in and get out as soon as we can. Education's not really focused on short-term courses yet. We have a traditional 8-week and 16-week courses. We need to reshape that to say what's best for the market, what's best for our students. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking and refocusing our attention to reevaluate our academic behavior, but also our academic offerings to make sure it fits both our traditional students, but also our adult students. We want to also re-engage our employers. Employers have a lot to tell us. And sometimes higher education, I'll be more specific, sometimes CR doesn't listen very closely, because sometimes we see it as a need to protect the education endeavor from unfair influences. I want to switch gears on that and get back to working with employers to say, what does CR need to offer? Is what CR offering in the way that we're offering fit the businesses that we're here to support? So we need to listen a lot more meaningfully and connect with our employers. But I'm going to ask our employers to make a commitment to CR as well. And that is, if we listen and we bring you in under the tent, if you will, we need you to commit to hiring our graduates. So we want to educate them, but we also want to make sure that they get a job with the employers that we want to partner with. So we want to refocus our attention on that. But also, because we are a comprehensive institution, it's important that we put out well-rounded students, and I think Dr. Gage may agree with me on this one, is that we need students who are skilled at their job, have job-focused competencies, workforce communication, math, teamwork, etc. But couple that with the need to have them be critical thinkers, and that's what you get from the liberal arts. So we need to be able to blend both types of learning at CR, so that a student graduating with a career education degree in house building not only can they build a house, which I have no idea how one does that, but also they have to graduate with the critical thinking skills and problem solving skills that allows them to be wonderful citizens of the county and also of the nation. So we need to be able to bridge that gap between our career education and our traditional liberal arts education. Work-based learning, and this goes back to a little bit of what I'm asking our employers to do. But we do on occasion offer internships and apprenticeships. We need to get back to offering a lot more. We want students both in the traditional liberal arts education, but also students in career education to be able to test the waters of their job to see if they even like the job. But on that hands-on job training can coincide with what they're learning in the classroom and then with the books. So when they graduate, they can hit the ground running with the business, and there is no gap between the graduates and the workplace. We want that to be as seamless as possible. So I want us to focus on work-based learning opportunities. And I don't know what those look like yet. And that's what the faculty, the deans, and the employers are going to start talking next year, how we can implement strategies to make this happen for our community. We also know that adult students and traditional students take a lot of non-credit courses. And why is non-credit so important? Non-credit, if you've been around Humboldt County long enough, non-credit used to be the purview of K through 12, HCOE. A few years ago, the state shifted non-credit to go to community colleges. Their thought, when they did this 5 years ago, is there's a certain amount of synergy between non-credit and credit courses. And non-credit, I love non-credit because it's so responsive and they're so agile. You could put a non-credit or community education course together in a day or two or a week to get students enrolled in it. For example, the courses that our community education department is running for de-escalation, that course was put together very quickly, but it serves a direct need to our community. So we want, going forward, there's a strong need to link both the non-credit side of the house for CR with the credit side. And we have not been able to do that successfully in the past. We've tried in fits and starts, but now for us to survive and to serve our students well, we need to be able to link both those sides of the house so a student will graduate well-rounded with a non-credit, adult ed course, and credit side. And what the beauty of a non-credit is those courses are free. So a student can take those free courses and use those in the degree or certificate to graduate. That is our hope. Matter of fact, we met with the local law enforcement last week to talk about how CR can offer a credit or non-credit course to help police officers with their professional growth. We offered a non-credit course. So we're talking about how we can help them after they graduate from our police academy, but on the job, to how we can help them navigate or deal with the stresses and of their further learning while they're police officers. All right, and so we need to do a better job of linking those two divisions. Credits of value. CR offers a lot of credits, a lot of credentials and degrees and certificates that have high value to itself. I want to be able to talk about making sure that every degree that we have or certificate that we offer has a direct connection to the labor market or direct support transfer to HSU. I would be happy, and I've said this on numerous occasions, I would be so happy if 100% of our transfer students transfer to HSU. That makes my life easier. And it makes sure that our students have a place to go, that it's seamless for them. We've worked hard to make sure that our traditional transfer departments, transfer degrees, English, Dr. Gage, but also other ones like communications and physics and math. Those have a direct transfer to HSU. And we've worked hard to make sure our courses match with theirs. So we want to be able to strengthen that connection. As a matter of fact, I've asked our academic affairs office now that no new degree will be approved unless they can transfer to HSU. Because it's just easier to have that direct transfer. But we also want to start talking about the stackability of our courses. So a student could take one course or two courses and come back and have that stackable with their past, with their future. We haven't done that effectively. And so we need to be able to, if you will, create stackable degrees and certificates that a student can stop out at CR for a year or two and come back seamlessly and pick up where they left off. And we haven't done that well, but we need to get back to doing that well, because students are stopping out all the time given COVID. And I don't really want them to be penalized because they can't pay for school and they're stopping out. We need to help them come back. I want to make sure that their ability to come back is easy. And there shouldn't be any institutional barriers for them to come back to us or HSU. Now I'm going to talk about something that's novel. And this is the first time I'm talking about this in public. I'm not sure how the state can really afford two overlapping education systems. Okay, and I know there's some communication, some conversation about how can we better link to HSU. I think that we have to work, HSU and CRS will work much more closely with the county to support regional economic development. Dr. Jackson and I, ever since he's come here, we have talked about how can we more closely link CR's education with HSU's education, because they're linked anyway. So how can we formalize that to make sure that students who come to CR will be taken care of with an automatic transfer to HSU? And with COVID kind of put our plans on the back burner. However, we have agreed to link our education master plan planning process, if you will. So HSU knows what CR is thinking and CR knows what HSU is thinking. So we can start planning in the future to move forward with, it shouldn't say a single education system because the state's not set up that way. But I think that we can work much more closely to make sure that if it's not a single education system, it's a seamless one. And anyway, so that was the end of the presentation. I just want, I really want folks to know that although this is a hard time fiscally, I think that CR is taking a very brave stance in trying to mitigate the problems fiscally now. But also we see it as a wonderful opportunity to change how we fundamentally see education. We haven't had this opportunity in many years, and the pandemic is forcing us, rightly so, to rethink our business. And I think that's healthy. And I think that our society expects us to change. We have an accountability to our constituents to make sure that we are doing the best we can for our community. And this is the best opportunity I've seen in 20 years in education, 25 years. So we're going to take advantage of this opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Fleimer. And I want to say that there are several questions here in the chat room and that others are invited to submit them if they'd like or to raise their hands. But at the moment, we have several of them. My first question actually is this presentation going to be available to us if people are interested in getting a copy of your slides? Because it was beautifully put together.
Of course, I can send that to you, Jane. I can send it to you once we're all done.
That's fabulous. And then comment from Rita, it sounds like what you were describing earlier is how the government handles K through 12. How many teachers were actually cut?
You mean from CR?
Yes.
I can't talk about how many teachers for this reason, because some teachers teach as many sections as they can. So some part-time faculty teach 2 classes. So I can say that we cut about 120 classes from our next year's, from the fall schedule.
So that might represent as many as 40, 50 teachers.
It could, yes.
Yeah. And what size faculty did that leave you with? That sounds terrible.
We have about 80, we have 77 full-timers, full-time faculty, and we have about 300 plus of us part-time faculty.
Okay. I know this same problem has happened at HSU, that they've had to let go part-time faculty and instructors,
Yes.
and that's been actually going on for some time. Have you considered an across-the-board percentage pay cut for everyone in order to diminish the number you have to cut?
Yes, I have, and that's what I have been doing for the last 3 years, as the budget was further cut in the last 3 years.
Do you have union issues with that?
We do have 2 unions, faculty as well as staff unions. We have relied on cutting salaries on unrepresented people, but we've also relied on not filling vacant positions in the past. But we've also found that that is also not fair to the people who are surviving. So we're looking at how do we become more efficient and effective and focus on the classes and the operations that we need in this COVID environment.
And Rita Carroll wants to know if you've had to eliminate any departments other than sports?
No, we have not. We have not had to eliminate any departments, just had to downscale on the number of employees.
And will CR continue to provide transfer to the UC system within the future guidelines in addition to HSU?
Absolutely, we do. But I also recognize, and we all also recognize, that we have a quality institution right down the road. And as much as I can do to strengthen that relationship for transfer, it's better for our students. So students will always have a choice, whether they want to go to HSU or UC. But I also want to make it easy for them to go to HSU and not than to go to UC. And also I recognize in this COVID environment that some students are questioning whether they want to pay the UC price to have online UC courses. And so I want to make sure that I'm working with Dr. Jackson that if a student wants to choose to go to CR and transfer to HSU, we make sure that happens easily and seamlessly.
Have you had issues with getting cooperation from employers to work with CR? Because this is a model that Germany has used very effectively in combining their employment requirements and their industries with cooperating with institutions. That isn't something we've had as a priority here in the United States, as far as I'm aware. And is that working? Our people and employers at the moment are probably more likely to be laying off people than accepting apprentices and having time to bring in interns.
Now, I'm not sure who asked that question, Jane.
I did.
Jane, that's a wonderful question, because actually my thought process is very much formulated from the European model of education. Actually, I don't think our employers are not the ones that the problem lies. Sometimes our institution serves as a barrier against getting real employer needs input, because sometimes we need to, I have to be careful how I answer this question, Jane. So sometimes institutions of higher education have a need to protect their core against all comers. We have an opportunity now to link with employers, so So we don't have a need. Our first inclination is not to protect what we've always done, but to question what we've always done to see what we can do better.
And are the unions open to reimagining education along the 8 parameters you've described? And are they working with you to do this? Sorry, that's mine too.
No, that's a beautiful question. I can't answer that question yet, Jane. The classified union, I have not talked to them about this, but I am going to talk about this at convocation next month when the fall semester begins. I think our faculty union would agree 100%, as long as I don't cross lines in a working condition issue. Really, the person that is, the body that is, that I need to work with a lot more closely is the academic senate, because the academic senate has purview over everything that is instructional related. The unions do not, just the academic senate does.
And okay, I guess then to follow up on that, does the academic senate, are they online? Are they on board? Are you, what kinds of issues are you facing with that?
Right now, I'm not facing any issues because they are part of a conversation of the education master planning process. So I'm not sure what the full Senate will think, but I know that they agree that we have to change how we fundamentally see curriculum if we're going to, number one, survive in the future, and two, if we're going to serve our county, our community, and our students better. So right now, I think they're supportive, but we haven't talked about the details, tactics, and strategies yet.
And Rita is wondering how is CR coordinating with HSU to deal with BLM issues for students and staff? And she asked you to please look at your private chat because she sent you a private question. And if you want to take a second to do that, we'll give you that and ask if anybody else has questions, because otherwise I'll just keep asking them.
Okay, so who, oh, I see it. Okay, yes, so Rita asked me the BLM question. I imagine it's a Black Lives Matter issue and not the Bureau of Land Management.
Yeah, Black
right?
Lives, sorry.
Because someone asked me the BLM issue and I said, Black Lives Matter, no, Bureau of Land Management issue. So, okay, I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. We are not coordinating our responses to the Black Lives Matter issue. Dr. Jackson and I see similarly what we're doing and why we need to do it, but we do not have coordinated action between both institutions. Both institutions are fundamentally different in that regard. HSU's learning environment is different from CR's learning environment in terms of Black Lives Matter issues. But we are firmly behind it. If you have read my columns, but also the Board of Trustees, they're firmly behind asking, actually they're going to tell me at the next board meeting officially and approve my new goals. Of the one goal, of course, is to review curriculum for culturally sensitive content. That's broad, but we need to start talking about changing our curriculum to make sure that it does reflect cultural diversity in some way. But also we're dealing with institutional racism at CR. And the board is firmly in support of me moving forward in both of these very sensitive areas. And that, quite frankly, is going to take a lot of our time and a lot of our patience to have these conversations. I'm going to leave it up to the academic senate and the faculty and the deans to talk about culturally sensitive content, because I think that we are doing very well there. But moving forward next year, quite honestly, where it's going to be difficult conversations is talking about racism in society and racism in the institution. Right now, there are two schools of thought. It's either here or it's not here. And given the election coming up in November, we want to have honest conversations. But we also want to set it up so that every voice is heard, even the voices that we don't want or we're pained to hear. But I think that we have to set up the learning environment for faculty, staff, and students that every voice is honored and heard and respected and not put on the margins. And so that's what we need to start doing next year, to have the honest conversations, or we're just going to be in the same spot 10 years ago as we find ourselves today. And that'd be shame on us if that happens.
I'm curious whether you're going to directly integrate a course or at least discussion of what structural racism is, institutional racism, what it looks like, how people can recognize it, and how they can recognize when they're crossing the bounds. Because, for example, I watched on Friday a commercial that it turned out to be from Chase Bank, and it demonstrated a black man driving up to a gas pump, pulling out his credit card, sticking it in and turned around, and gee, he'd parked on the wrong side, so he couldn't put it in there. So he had to reach across, and when he went to put it in, it wouldn't, guess what, it wouldn't make it. And so he said something that I don't recall, went back, hung it up, and I called Chase Bank. And I said, excuse me, you are basically presuming that blacks are stupid. That is what you are showing, and you should fire your ad agency. And we need to basically allow people to understand this is the kind of thing that is so bad. And if we don't alert people to the kinds of issues, and young people in particular, so that they recognize what they're doing. And I know you're part, or certainly Arcata has Equity Arcata, and I know you've probably participated in putting feedback into some of this. Certainly Ron White has done a presentation for us in OLLI on white privilege and microaggressions, but most white people, Caucasians, don't understand how they're crossing the boundaries. And without learning about that, they're not going to change their behaviors. Well, how do you respond to that?
First thing is, you're absolutely correct. But I also think that there are some racist attitudes and institutional racism, not just at CR, but as you say, at Chase Bank. Absolutely, there's a lot of learning we have to do. What's key, though, is not that I only agree with you, Jane, but we have to be able to set up the conversation so we get out of this tribalistic conversation. So it really is about people talking with instead of at, and we're actually listening. And that it has to be genuine and honest conversations about it. And that's what we have not been able to do recently, is to get out of the tribalistic level of dialogue. And I think HSU and CR as education institutions, we should be able to model those things. But CR has a lot of work to do in that regard. But Jane, I would also offer that, and I'm just going to be very direct here, is I understand, we have to be careful on, we have to define our terms here. Because yes, there is white privilege, but I would also argue that women have also been in a position where they're acted against as well. So although people of color are stigmatized and people of color have some things that were done to them and continue to do, but I think in the same vein, there's a sexist attitude that also is inherent in education that we also must deal with. So we have lots of isms, not just racism, but sexism is also very, very prevalent in our society, in our institutions. So both of those problems must be dealt with, or else we won't go, we will not move forward.
Julie Fulkerson has commented that I'm so grateful for your innovative leadership partnerships with community and HSU. And Rita Carroll has asked, how many people of color are on the staff and student population? Please clarify the differences between HSU and CR in this matter. Until white people can experience Black skin, I don't think they will ever really get it.
That is absolutely true. Thank you for the question. At CR, there is one African American on staff, and that's me. Hispanic Americans, we have a few. They happen to be married to each other, Jose, and but there are very, very few of us here. And HSU is doing much better at it. Tom's been able to, Dr. Jackson's been able to bring in key administrators who are people of color and women, which is just phenomenal. I wish I could do the same thing. So Dr. Jackson's pushing the envelope, and I appreciate his leadership in this regard. But CR has a lot more work to do, especially in the faculty ranks and the staff ranks and the administrative ranks.
And Rita went on to ask, under the circumstances and the financial restrictions, how can you solicit for more diversity? Can you do it on a nonprofit basis or working with community organizations? How can you pull this off? Because it's tough.
Actually, there are two ways that I'm moving forward with, Jane, on this issue. One is working with our community to help identify people of color to serve in position. Now, just because we're in fiscal challenges, we still have key positions that we need to look for. For example, we need to find a coordinator for our police academy and a director for our law enforcement academy. So those are two key areas that if I can get someone of color or a woman in one or two of those positions, that sends a strong message that CR means business. But we still, next year, we're going to have some faculty positions open and staff positions open that we still need to look for.
And Tom, I know you've been trying to get attention. Unmute yourself, Tom. Tom, unmute yourself.
Myself, okay, sorry. I really applaud your vision and the enumeration of each of these steps that you're pursuing, and I think that it really sounds wonderful. There is a wonderful opportunity in chaos of COVID to make improvements that are going to be lasting for many years. But I'd like to go back to that topic that we're discussing, because I take a 3-mile walk on a track a block and a half from where I live, which is the track of Toady Thomas Elementary School, an African American whose name now is that school. And his daughter was in the system. My wife is on the Board of Education at Fortuna High School, and I don't know that she is still employed in the system, but the granddaughter is. We have a tremendous heritage that I think it can be built upon. The other point that I'd like to make, and as Jane knows, I have been absolutely a devotee of the work of Kenya Barish, who created this incredible series of television shows in Hollywood, Blackish, for instance.
Yep.
And I was offering, when COVID blossomed, I was offering a class team taught with Tiffany Miner of Trinidad, where the members of OLLI could see the incredible achievement of that series in identifying, even, the title is Blackish, but I was, the nod, for instance, there was one episode about the nod that African Americans give one another. Yes. And with a wonderful allusion to just that we nod to one another. Well, I was in Prague in Christmas, And I'm walking down the streets where Steve Dubček was battling with the Russian tanks in 86. And a guy walking my direction was the same age, in our 80s, you know.
Yeah.
And we gave the nod. And that's the point that Barish is making in every episode.
It's true.
So maybe there should be a course on Blackish at CR. You know, that's a really great piece of art.
It is. The challenge, Dr. Gage, is this. Finding faculty who will, number one, champion the curriculum,
Yeah.
and number two, teach the course.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of people with the credentials to be able to be validated, if you will, to teach that course. So, Dr. Gage, if you're interested, give me a call.
Okay.
I think he will be. Actually, I was also going to suggest that as part of integrating your credit and non-credit education, you could put some of these things in, and I don't know what credentials are required. In this case, do you have to have totally acceptable academic credentials, or are professional credentials acceptable? Like if you're an attorney or you're a, you know, master's in an area or a PhD.
Yeah, so the credit side is pretty much governed by the education code on the MQs for faculty. Non-credit and community ed is based on your professional background. So it could be anyone can teach a non-credit course or a community ed course as long as you have that background to do it.
That's great. Are people, perhaps you might make people aware of that through one of your articles and give some examples of what you've done and give some examples of the kinds of apprenticeships, etc., that are possible for people as a way of encouraging students to come back, not only after they've been separated, but if you make some of these options available to people, and I think it needs to get out maybe even through the senior news, and somehow you need to get at the public because Time Standard doesn't have as wide, maybe you need to do it through Facebook or ways like that in order to catch more people.
Great idea. So thank you, Jane. I'll give that some more thought. Thank you so much.
And do other people other than myself and Rita have any questions? And Tom, we'd love to hear from you. Yes? I'd like to ask a question as to how many adults you find coming back to pick up new skills at CR, and how the nursing program is doing and integrating with HSU.
Okay, the answer to your first question is we probably get maybe 100, maybe 200 across the whole district, which is not just Eureka, Humboldt, but we also have Del Norte and Klamath Trinity and the Hooper Reservation. So we have those campuses as well. So we get a significant number of adults in the classroom. The average age of adults in our classroom is about 28 years old. And so we do have some adults in the classroom. I think COVID is going to give us the opportunity of having more adults reentry into the institution. And right now it's a little early to tell what fall semester looks like in terms of the demographics, but that is exactly what we're looking at. And Jane, to your question, what was your second question, Jane?
How you're integrating, how well the integration of the nursing program with HSU is going, and how many students you have engaged in that?
That is a jewel for us. So we are integrating very strongly with HSU. There has not been a problem. It is actually going forward as we dreamed it would go forward. The only problem that I have is I can increase the number of students in our program. Right now we have a little about 50, 55, maybe 60 students. I guarantee I can transfer to HSU about 47 or 50. I can increase the capacity if I can find more faculty. So we have a couple of nursing positions out there we're searching for, but I can't find nurses who will give up their day job, if you will, and come and get a tenured job and teach for half the pay, quite honestly. And so pay is the other differential that we have not been able to overcome. But
I know a number of nurses and doctors have been, and staff have become unemployed as a result of the virus and the lack of normality taking on the usual kinds of cases at the hospitals because they've had to preserve space for COVID. I know Mad River shut down a lot of had to shut down its surgeries, optional surgeries for a period of time. And thus I know people who were for a short period of time on furlough. And I wonder if you could tap into that and if that population is going to continue to be available as the hospitals open up.
Jane, thank you. I had not realized that certain nurses were seen as surplus at the moment. So I did not know that. So I will research that. I understand that Mad River reopened or is about to reopen other services.
Yeah, they have done that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I had not heard that. So let me follow up. I appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else have questions? Tom? Anybody?
Looks like Dan had a question that's in the chat. Jane, if you want to
I
include
missed it. Okay, Dan. How many of the classes at CR will be virtual and how many in person for this year or have you decided yet?
Okay. So as you know, for fall semester, 90% of our courses will be virtual and 10% will be face-to-face. And that equates to about 30, maybe 25 sections will be face-to-face courses in our career education program, like welding and construction tech and manufacturing tech. But we also have some PE courses that will also be face-to-face. So we put a pretty high bar in terms of if a class cannot be transitioned or converted from face-to-face to virtual in some way. So I will start our discussion with the faculty and staff in September this fall to determine where CR will go in spring semester. I envision that we will continue spring semester that we're doing fall unless all the COVID models are just upended from what I just read this morning. But I want to have that conversation with my faculty and staff before I decide how we're going to move forward.
Another couple of questions. Do you have any Native American teachers?
That I don't know. I misspoke. On the Eureka campus, I'm not. We have one or two faculty that are have some Native American blood on the Eureka campus, but of course we also have a significant number at our KT Hoopla Reservation campus as well.
And so in Hoopa in particular?
In Hoopla in particular, yes.
Okay.
And we also have a few that one or two that teach within our history department or sociology department. And we are working on a Hoopla language class that our Dean of Humanities is working on with a faculty member to create and go through the academic senate, but that course has to be face-to-face. And that Native American instructor is working with our Dean to create it. I just don't know when I can offer that course given the situation that we're currently in.
And Butch Thompson wanted to know, what about other minorities, including Asian, Latino, and the LGBT communities, including in your recruitment?
Yes, we do put that as a priority in both our recruitment of our students, but also recruitment of our staff and faculty. Those are high targets for us. There is a bill going through the legislature that I've sent a letter and strong support of an affirmative action that will give us more strength to be able to do the things that we need to do. So we may be going backwards a little bit in time to go forwards in
In
society.
progress. Yeah.
Progress. So we'll see how this flows.
Is that likely to go through, do you think?
If you would have asked me this 3 months ago, I would have said no. But if you're asking me today, I said strong possibility, given where the society's headed in terms of being sensitive to the issues of race and institutional racism. I think it's a strong possibility of working. In California, I can't answer for Texas or Arizona, but for California, possibly.
I know you have had a program where students get subsidized basically, I think 2,000 a semester, 2,000 a year for board and room. Is that continuing to be in place, and are you getting the funding for it? I know you had funding for all of last year, and I think for what, about 8 students?
We talked about our housing insecure students, Jane?
Yes, yes.
I am expanding that program this fall semester. So we had 8 students that we targeted last year. I told them to set 25% of our dorms aside, and that's about 25 or 30 spaces now for fall semester. And
That's a major increase.
it's a major increase, absolutely, especially during this age of COVID. I don't want a barrier of someone finding a place to live to get their education. So yes, we have some funding for 3 years for this program.
Have you had any further discussion about the kids camping in the woods behind the campus, or allowing students to park and be safely in their cars in parking lots who have homeless issues?
We have talked about the students in the woods. Yes, so we don't want students living in the woods at all. So if they self-identify as homeless, we will automatically put them in the dorms with a counselor and money paid for both their room and board as well as their education. I just need students to be able to self-identify to say, I need help. Students are reticent to say, I need help. But once they do, I have the money and the space for them. We are putting up towers in the parking lot for students to be able to have access to Wi-Fi,
Well, that's fantastic.
both on this campus and Del Norte. So we're doing all the things that we can to make sure we have no barriers at all from this institution for student success.
And I think you also provide showers and access to food and things like that for ones who have issues like that.
We do. So we have restrooms and showers set aside in our PE complex, where we have a very good food pantry at all 3 campuses. And we are going to expand that if we have the money from the state coming in August. So we have a very strong food pantry.
Do you have to apply for that funding through grants and things like that? And who does that?
We did first have to apply for a grant, which we received, but the state, if the state budget holds in August, they have a block grant that will just be given to every community college for food pantries. So we have a lot of money that we received from the state for 3 years for homelessness and food pantry, and more money should be coming if the state approves a final budget that is good.
And Rita wanted to know, where are you getting the money to expand the program? Okay, that explains it, she just said. I know you're getting money also from the Humboldt Area Foundation. Is that true?
Yes, we did. We have a lot of private donor money as well. Absolutely. So our community stepped up and helped us when we needed it initially. So it has been fantastic, and they're continuing to help. We just did a survey that I have the results that we will release in the next couple of weeks, that almost 65% of our CR student population I've identified as housing insecure coming into fall semester, 65%.
Is that a new survey that you just completed?
Yes.
That's huge.
It shows you the magnitude of the problem that we're facing.
And it's likely to become worse at the end of the month when unemployment insurance dies, assuming it does.
Jane, you have it correct. That's exactly what's going to happen.
Ah, scary stuff, isn't it?
It is, and yes, but we're going to do what we can to help these students so that they don't miss a beat.
Is there some way you can find ways of integrating more community support? And how are you reaching out to try to do that? Not only in terms of volunteers to provide food and working with Food for People, or working with the senior community, the Senior Resource Center, for example. Are there institutions or groups you can reach out to, whether it's Rotary or whomever, to facilitate this re-education and reimagination of CR?
That is one of the tactics, Jane, that we're going to put in the Education Master Plan, to reach out to Chambers of Commerce as well as Rotaries on our advisory group. So we're just trying to develop that list right now.
And Rita just asked, can you work with students like the AFA program where people put up students for no charge?
We can. My concern there is with the liability. If CR is officially backing someone, then if that person misbehaves with a student, then CR is liable. So I have to do a lot more research to make sure that our liability is lessened if CR backs a program such as this.
And Butch Thompson asks, are staff and clients screened for COVID, and is testing provided? And if so, is it timely?
Part of our fall reopening protocol that actually I'm writing about this in this Friday's Time Standard article is that we are actually screening both students in face-to-face, but also screening for employees coming back. That they will have to answer the requisite questions that are pre-screened, like normal COVID. But we are also working with the county to have their testing vehicle on the CR campus a couple weeks or a week before classes begin. So any student, any staff member can come in and get tested. Are
you, I spoke with my stepdaughter, and a friend of hers who had a sign company repurposed his company to provide dividers, plexiglass dividers. And he's been selling them all over the place. So he has this great big business going that's very profitable. Is that something we should be encouraging to either be happening at CR or help get a local business funded to provide the equipment we need to make schooling safe?
We are actually doing that now. So Steve McKenzie, our director of facilities, he's already reached out to some vendors and manufacturers to help us put screens on the necessary places.
Is that something you can actually do on site and maybe create a little business where you could get some money for yourselves?
CR is not able to move that quickly, Jane, to be able to do this, because we would put it into the academic side, and since fall semester hasn't started, it's hard to get that started. But we want to do what we can to get the campus safe for people to come back to work, if that's what we do.
And Tom, you had a question. Mute yourself. Tom, unmute yourself. Find that button. I know it's there somewhere. There you go.
Okay, am I on? Okay.
You're on.
Okay, sorry. I just was fascinated by the drift of the conversation and the point that Butch and Rita were making. among the different, there's a couple of models that you would likely know of. The Humboldt English Express that Marianne Heighton has been running on her own, former teacher at Winship, and OLLI's own Lucy Salazar, two really interesting models that kind of overlap both the academic matriculation that's offered in the institution in addition to these different outreaches within the community. Lucy's program particularly engages students of minorities by involving the parents of the students of those minorities in overall programs and projects. It's a terrifically exciting model as I understand it. And Marianne Heitken's model is a little bit different in that she addresses 27 different languages within the county in her classes to bring about English fluency among those students. But that is just a particular generational group as opposed to what Lucy's doing, which is a filial kind of linkage that goes across generations. But just two great models that I find fascinating. And it seems to me congruent with exactly your mission.
Dr. Gates, thank you. I didn't know anything about this, so I'll do some research about that.
I'll get it to you.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that.
And Keith, do you have any, well, does anybody else have any further questions? If not, Keith, would you like to do a wrap up?
Oh my gosh, this has been the highlight of my week. It's only Monday. So, Jane, thank you for the opportunity of doing this. And Kim, thanks for your help. I really appreciate everyone being involved and asking questions and giving me some ideas. Feel free, please drop me an email, drop me a note of any thoughts that come to mind that I could do my job better, or I can better link CR to our community in any way, move CR forward. Please let me know. I'm open to all ideas and suggestions.
And well, thank you ever so much, Keith. We really appreciate it. Why don't you give them your email so they can contact you, or the way to contact you?
Okay. It is Keith, Keith, _Flamer, FLAMER, at redwoods.edu.
Great. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.